Welcome, and in today's vlog we're going to be looking at two different athletes, one that is limited by capacity and a second that is limited by skill, both athletes performing the back squat. Okay, so my athlete that I found was limited through his capacity was initially struggling to hit depth in the squat. We first tried with just the ball on the ground so that he was squatting down to the ball, and from here he was struggling to produce enough force to actually stand back up, as well as falling off balance and just really struggling to sustain that control within his body. So you can see that he is limited by range of motion, and this would suggest that there was maybe a capacity in his strength that wasn't enabling him to hit that depth. You can also, if you compare the athletes side by side, my one that has a capacity issue and one that has a skill issue, you can see here that the range of motion in the ankles is very different. So my athlete on the left was struggling to mobilise through his ankles, only hitting 93.7-degree angle, in comparison to my athlete with a skill issue on the right that generates the ankle range of 67.9 degrees. So this would suggest that it would be worth stepping away from the barbell to look at if there is any limitations within ankle mobility, and the same for hip mobility as well. So when we actually looked at his squat from behind, you can see that there's a slight shift towards the left. So his right hip is externally rotating more than his left, and his left hip is internally rotating slightly more than his right. So I then wanted to look at if this shift over to the left-hand side was still happening when holding onto a pole to ensure that you had that balance, and it is clear that it is. You can see his right leg over here that more than you can see his left, so that right hip is externally rotating a lot more than the left-hand side. So from here I wanted to check whether there was maybe a limitation in the right ankle, in the maybe he was struggling to move through that range of motion, had more range of motion in the left ankle, so his way to still get down into that squat is to shift over and use that extra range of motion that he has in the left rather than the right. So we can see here that it's worth noting that there's more range of motion through the left ankle than there is through the right ankle. The left ankle's giving 51.9 degrees that he can move through, and in the right he's only hitting 58.4 degrees in that range of motion that he's able to move through. So the last thing I wanted to check was flexibility through the hips to see whether there was an issue here that was causing him to shift to the left, as well as the difference in range of motion in his ankles. And we can see here that he's hitting an angle of 48 degrees in the right hand side of his hips. And on the left hand side, initially as I was doing it, I could feel it was a lot tighter. It was struggling to sort of get through that range of motion. And here we managed to create an angle of 49.8 degrees. So the left hip is a lot tighter than the right. I also wanted to see what would happen when we externally rotated the hip, whether we could still hit a good range of motion in both sides, or whether one, again, would be a lot more flexible than the other side. So on the right hand side here, we can see the range of motion actually looks pretty good. So there'd be no issues getting down in that hip. However, on the left, there is a struggle. You can see his right leg starts to come off the floor as I push towards his left. So if we go back to that squat that we saw initially, where we can see the shift over to the left, there are several reasons as I've assessed as to why this is happening. So to summarise the capacity issues that we found during the back squat was hip mobility, specifically in the left hand side of the body. He was externally rotating through the right hip to allow that hip flexion, which was forcing internal rotation on the left hip, which was then causing that left lateral shift. We also have a lack of range of motion through the right ankle, which could also be contributing to that shift over to the left. And we also had slight flexion in the top of the spine, and this could be due to the inability to engage and activate his lats when squatting. So if we look at my athlete that is limited slightly by skill, we can see he is generally very strong. However, as he hits the bottom of his squat, he has a slight shift forward in his centre of mass and the heels come just slightly off the floor. We could also see as the movement continues, at the bottom of the squat, he does have a slight tuck under of the hips where he's going so low. He obviously has great range of motion within his hips, and after doing an ankle test to look at his ankle mobility to see whether that was why his heels were coming off the floor, it's clear that that was not the case. And actually, by simply just cueing to keep his heels on the floor and to not squat quite so low, we've actually managed to avoid the tucking under of the hips and the heels coming off the floor. So moving on to the hang power clean now. This is my athlete where we found that there was a skill-based issue here. You can see in the left that there is a tiny jump forward, and on the right hand side, as we have increased the weight to make it a much heavier load, there is actually quite a big jump forward as he receives it in the catch position. So when we looked at why this was happening, I could actually see that the bar wasn't staying close enough to the body as the weight had increased, and he was actually pulling away from the body, which meant that in order to catch it, he had to jump forward to follow that bar through. And we resolved this issue by just practicing the pulling phase of the movement and ensuring that the barbell was staying as close to the body as possible on the pull. So for this athlete here, it was a very new movement and it was his first time doing it. So from initially looking at him, there were 2 points that stood up for me. First of all, the elbows, where he was really struggling to get the elbows up high. This was meaning that to catch it, he was leaning right back. And the second one was that there was no breaking in the hips, which meant that he was just finishing the movement with his body from the knees to the shoulders in one straight diagonal line. You can actually see here the difference in movement patterns between the two athletes. You've got one breaking up the hips, one standing up tall, nice long spine when catching it, and obviously the other one leaning right back in order to get that bar up to the chest. So from here, I had my athlete on the left move onto a bar that was placed on the rack, and we just had him practicing getting the elbows up on the bar. However, from here, it was quite clear that there were mobility issues and that was something that was going to have to be worked on before we moved back into performing the hang power clean.